few years ago, my wife had just started studying for her master's degree, and I was beginning my PhD program. We moved to a new city to make it work, but money was tight. Rents were high, and the only place we could really afford was in a pretty rough neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of area you'd brag about living in, but for the most part, it was manageable. The building itself was old, a little run down, but the neighbors were decent enough, except for the apartment right next to ours. Next door, 3 guys shared a place and a roommate setup. Not long after we moved in, one of them packed up and left. This didn't exactly stand out at that moment. People come and go all the time in rentals, right? But soon after, I was walking into the building one day, and I caught one of the other roommates walking out. In the midst of our small talk, he confided in me that his other roommate, the one who stayed behind, was trying to get him kicked out so he could have the whole apartment to himself. It was right around that time that things started to spiral. The power struggle next door, along with the arguments that came with it, grew louder and more frequent, and it got bad enough that the police were showing up fairly regularly. For a while, this whole situation didn't touch us directly. We did what we could to keep our heads down and just stay out of it. Eventually, though, that roommate who had confided in me moved out. And that's when the last one standing completely lost it. He went wild. Every weekend, it was parties until 6 in the morning, music blasting through the walls, and people coming and going at all hours. Neighbors started calling the police nonstop, and more than once, his apartment was searched for drugs. I knew he had a problem. I'd watched him throw alcohol bottles off of his balcony, once narrowly missing someone below. I think back, he even got into a physical fight with another one of our neighbors. At first, though, he was polite enough to us. If we asked him to turn his music down, he usually would. He even invited us over a few times. One of those occasions, he proudly showed off his drug and booze collection, like this was some kind of hobby of his. At one point that night, he even picked up a bottle ready to chuck it off the balcony again. We actually had to talk him down from doing it. But things really changed for the worse when he lost his job. That's when the music and chaos went from just a weekend thing to an everyday nightmare. He obviously didn't care anymore. It was blasting constantly, and no matter how many times we would knock on his door, it didn't stop. This became a huge problem for my wife, who was studying at home. Imagine trying to read dense textbooks or write papers while the walls are shaking with bass. We complained to the landlady, who was this nice older woman that clearly already had way too much on her plate. She admitted that she was in the process of planning his eviction, but this woman moved at a snail's pace, so in the meantime, we were the ones stuck dealing with him. I was thinking about that one day, and it made me remember the last time we were in his apartment. He had these massive Sonos speakers. Those are the ones that he would play his music through. And me being aware of the audio tech behind it, I knew that these speakers connected to Wi-Fi. That's when the idea clicked. I dug up an old university laptop that I had lying around. I installed Linux and set it up with a Wi-Fi penetration testing package. It took a little fiddling, but once it was up and running, we were actually able to gain access to his Wi-Fi. Anytime the music got too loud, one command and bam, his whole network would go down. Instant silence. Now, this wasn't something we abused. We weren't trying to be petty about it. If he wanted to listen to music, fine, but when it got unbearable, that's when we would pull the plug. That silence that immediately followed, usually punctuated by his frustrated screams, felt like a little taste of revenge. It gave us a sense of control in a situation where we'd had none. There were a few occasions where we had to use our new power, but everything came to a head one weekday when it happened again. His music was blasting so loud that you could feel it in your chest. My wife sent the command, and down went his network. This time, though, he snapped. We heard him screaming, slamming doors, smashing things inside of his apartment. It was actually pretty crazy to hear. We called the police. At first, they brushed it off, surely thinking that this was just another noise complaint. But when they asked for his name and we gave it, their tone changed. Oh, him? Within minutes, multiple officers were swarming the building. He didn't really cooperate. although it doesn't seem like he was the person to do so anyway. And before long, they had him in handcuffs and threw him into the back of a squad car. Here's the thing though, they didn't just arrest him. Due to some of the things that he was saying as police were trying to talk him out of his apartment, they ended up taking him to the hospital on a psych hold. When he got out and came back a few days later, he actually knocked on her door and apologized. That in and of itself was a surprise, but it wasn't the only one. Standing behind him was a man, a big man, leather jacket, equipped with that menacing presence perk. It turned out, this was his probation officer. The message that we got from this visit was that clearly he was being watched now. A few weeks later, the neighbor moved out for good, and after that, the building was all quiet again. He never found out that we were the ones messing with his Wi-Fi, so he never figured out that we were directly or indirectly what triggered his meltdown and landed him in psychiatric care that day. But honestly, given everything that he'd done in his tenure as our neighbor, from the fights to the sleepless nights, I think it's fair to say that he had it coming. My wife is the reason that I'm still alive today. I don't think she realizes that she once saved my life, and to this day I've never explicitly told her. This was nearly a decade ago, back when she was just my girlfriend. At the time, I was going through one of the darkest stretches of my life. Everything about it felt heavy. Work wasn't going anywhere, I didn't feel like I had a real sense of direction, and every day seemed like a repeat of the one before. My own personal Groundhog Day. The people around me probably thought I was just stressed or burnt out, but inside, I felt like I was drowning. I didn't talk about it with anyone. I bottled everything up. I thought that it was on me to handle it myself, that admitting how badly I was struggling was some kind of weakness. I know now just how dangerous that mindset is, but at the time, it was all I ever knew. One night, I got in my car and just started driving. I had no destination in mind, no plan, just an urge to escape my life. Eventually, I ended up at a bridge on the outskirts of my town. Looking back on it now, I can't even say if I had a real intention of jumping. Maybe I did. Maybe I just wanted to scare myself into feeling alive. But then there's a potential that I just wanted to sit there, staring into the void, letting the thought linger. And that's what I did. I parked my car, turned the engine off, turned the lights off, and just sat there in silence with my thoughts. For 30 minutes, I don't think I moved. I stared out into the dark, thinking some of the worst thoughts I'd ever had. Thoughts that, when I recount them, still make me shudder thinking about them today. It felt like I was getting closer and closer to decision-making time. And that's when my phone chimed. It was a text from my girlfriend. It was something simple and normal. "Are you working overtime tonight? When should I have your dinner ready?" That was it. And if I'm being honest, that casual set of questions absolutely shattered me. I completely broke down in my car. I went from sitting there like a stone to sobbing so hard that I couldn't even catch my breath. I kept thinking, how could I have even considered doing something so selfish? How could I think about leaving behind the one person who actually cared about me? Her text reminded me that I mattered. To her, I mattered. She was at home thinking about me, planning dinner out, waiting for me to walk through the door like any other normal night, and here I was, parked on the edge of something that I might never come back from. I sat there for another half hour, not dwelling in my thoughts, just trying to pull myself together. Eventually, I drove home. When I walked in, there she was, smiling at me like nothing was wrong. Dinner was on the table, and I don't think I've ever had a plate of pork chops, veggies, and rice taste so delicious. I remember hugging her like I'd never hugged anyone before. I couldn't stop holding her. I don't think she realized why, but that night, that hug was my way of silently saying thank you for saving me. Taking a step back, that dinner was delicious, but it was amazing for another reason too. Not entirely because of the food itself, but because of what it meant. That plate of pork chops wasn't just supper. It was proof that someone loved me enough to want me home. Life moved on from there. A few years later, I proposed to her. She said yes, and every single day since, I've woken up beside her feeling like I won the lottery. She has no idea how close she came to losing me before we even had a chance to build a future together. And like I said to start, I've never told her. She knows I was going through a rough time back then, but she doesn't know how deep it went. She doesn't know about the bridge. She thinks I was working overtime that night. And the truth is, I don't think I'll ever tell her. Not because I'm ashamed, but because she has her own battles to fight. She's been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she already carries enough on her shoulders. I don't want to add another weight for her to bear. I figure the least I can do in this situation is be the one who carries this secret. I go with her to therapy every week and wait in the lobby while she talks with her counselor. I've read countless books and articles about BPD, trying to understand what she goes through and how best to support her. It literally feels like the smallest thing I can do in return for the gift she gave me without even knowing it. Sometimes late at night, I still think back to that moment on the bridge. How such a simple text, a reminder that someone cared, pulled me back from the edge. I can't help but wonder how many other people out there have been in that same position, waiting for some sort of sign, a reason to turn their car around and just go home. That's actually why I'm sharing this now, because the truth is, it doesn't take a grand gesture to make a difference in someone's life. Sometimes, it can be the smallest acts of love that save people. A question, a hug, a plate of dinner waiting on the table. We don't always get to know what battles the people around us are fighting. We don't always see the darkness that they carry with them. But what we can do is choose kindness. We can reach out, ask questions, check in, and remind the people we love that they matter to us. Because you never know. The difference between someone staying and someone leaving could come down to one simple moment of love. I want to encourage anyone that hears this to operate with kindness. Show the people in your life that they matter. Even if it feels small or ordinary to you, it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear in their darkest moment of life. My wife saved me with a text message she doesn't even remember sending. That's how powerful love can be. I'm a young surgeon. That's the first thing you should know. Most of my peers are older, more seasoned, with years of training and practice behind them. I push myself hard. I finished school as quickly as humanly possible. I rushed into residency, and now I'm in a fellowship where everything I do feels like it carries the weight of someone's future. People look at me and see confidence, maybe even talent, but on the inside, I constantly feel the weight of inexperience pressing down on me. And that weight has never been as crushing as it was earlier this week. The patient was a baby girl, barely a couple of weeks old. She was a preemie, fragile but still alert in her own way. She had been born with a condition so severe that without immediate surgical intervention, she wouldn't live. Her parents knew this. Everyone in the operating room knew this. The thing is, her condition is rare. I had only ever seen the surgery performed once in person, just a single time, but in this field, you don't get endless opportunities to observe. At some point, you have to step up, and my attending, the senior surgeon overseeing me, decided that this was my chance. As I was scrubbing in, I did my best to try to steady myself. My heart was already pounding before I even touched a scalpel. This wasn't like the adult cases that I'd handled before. This was different. Her entire chest was barely bigger than my hand. Her heart, no larger than a walnut. Every movement I was to make had to be precise. There was literally no room for error. At first, things seemed to go well. I opened her up carefully, exposing the tiny structures that had to be repaired. I assessed just as I'd been taught, walking myself through each and every step. For a moment, I let the belief that I could do this creep into my head. Then came the cannulation of the aorta, a step I had done several times before on adult hearts. The process was familiar to me. Make a small incision, insert the cannula, tighten the purse string sutures. It's rather simple in theory, but this wasn't an adult heart. This was a newborn's. As soon as I incised, blood spurted out, as it always does. Only this time, the aorta was so small, the tissue so fragile that everything happened faster than my hands could keep up with. I inserted the cannula, but when I tightened the sutures, they tore right through the tissue. Suddenly, there was blood everywhere. I tried to recover. I clamped, I suctioned, I tried to control the hemorrhage, but before I even knew it, it was too late. This wasn't like with an adult, where you sometimes have seconds to fix your mistake. With her, every second was critical, and too many had already passed. She had lost too much blood before I could stabilize her, and she passed on that table. The room went quiet except for the hum of machines and the sounds of my own breathing behind my mask. I froze, still holding the surgical instruments in my hands, and no one in that room said anything for a long moment. While they were aware of the outcome, the nurses and the assistants present weren't entirely sure what had happened, but my attending did. When the surgery was called, I walked out to scrub. I thought maybe I could use this moment to collect myself, but that's when my attending came in. This man that I respected dearly held the most somber look on his face I'd ever seen before. He didn't raise his voice at me, but what he said was far worse than any yelling I'd ever received. He looked me square in the eye and told me that that baby's death was my fault, that my bites had been spaced wrong, that my incision had been too large, and that I had failed at the single most delicate moment imaginable. At the end of this conversation, he told me that I had better learn from this, because it could never happen again. There was no comfort in his words. There was no softening of the blow, because what could you really do? It was just the brutal, undeniable truth that my mistakes within that room led to the death of a child. The worst part wasn't hearing it from him, though. The worst part was standing just feet away while he went to speak with their parents. I stood in the corner of the room as he sat them down and explained that there had been complications, and that despite our best efforts, their daughter hadn't made it. I'll never forget the sound of their cries echoing down the hallway. I'll never forget the way the mother collapsed into her husband's arms, or the way he buried his face in his hands like the weight of the world had just crushed him. They had trusted us, trusted me with their daughter's life, and I had utterly failed them. Since then, I can't stop replaying it in my head. Every single moment of that surgery, over and over like some cruel loop that I can't escape. I wonder what it would have been like if my attending had stepped in sooner, if he had taken over at the crucial moment, but that's not how this works. I was the surgeon that day, and the responsibility falls onto me. That little girl could have grown up to celebrate birthdays, school, made friends, and fallen in love. She should still be alive right now, cradled in her parents' arms, but instead, she's gone. And there's nothing that I can do to take away the feeling that it's solely because of me. I keep asking myself if I'm really cut out for this. Being a surgeon isn't like most professions. When we make mistakes, people don't just lose money or time. They potentially lose their lives. And no amount of learning can change the fact that someone had to die for me to gain that experience. I wanted this career because I thought saving lives would give my own life meaning. But now I can't stop wondering if I have the right to keep doing this. If every time I pick up a scalpel, I'm gambling with someone else's future. I don't know if I can forgive myself. My mother used to go to funerals at her church for the elderly with no remaining family, or the unidentified homeless. I'm not a particularly religious person as an adult, but I try to continue her legacy of good deeds by going to funerals when there's no one else. Usually not more than once or twice a year, as that's about all I can handle. I was at one a few weeks ago for a retirement home tenant who had no remaining family, and there were only 4 or 5 people there, mostly church couples, all that would have been strangers to her. There was a biblical reading, and we prayed, and about 15 minutes through the service, a young man comes running in crying. He tells the pastor that he's sorry he's late, but he was only just contacted this morning, and he'd like to say a few words. He gives a tearful, heart-wrenching eulogy about how he can't believe he let himself lose touch with his mother, and that they'd always had a turbulent relationship, eventually grew estranged. but when he got the phone call this morning about his mother's death, it hit him that it had been a full 6 years since they'd spoken, and he only wishes he could have been the bigger man. The especially troubling thing was he was saying things like, "As most of you probably know, my mother was an avid reader," or, as she may have mentioned, "Our family dynamic was never the same after Pop died." And I came to the uneasy realization that he thought we were all friends of hers. So he sits down and whispers to the pastor, "How many other speakers are there?" And this poor pastor is faced with the task of having to reveal that his mother evidently died without any friends. So the pastor just says, "There are no more." He's clearly looking for the words to break it to this guy when he cuts him off and says, "Of course, I'm sorry I was so late. I never called the home to update my contact info after I got out of the service, and I was in Canada for work when they finally got a hold of me to break the news." He said he'd really like to talk to the pastor more after the service, so they said the closing prayer, and that was that. The young man started asking the pastor questions about how involved his mother was in church life, when one of the women, not realizing this conversation was going on, announced at the podium everyone should filter into the main lobby for light refreshments. Nobody wanted to be the one who had to explicitly state that they were just here out of, essentially, duty or pity. So he lined up and received the son, offered condolences, but then everyone rushed out without even stopping for a cookie. He tried to stop the people leaving and ask them questions, but they were too quick. I couldn't bear it. It was all too emotional, and I'd never experienced anything like this at one of these funerals. So I did something I still regret. I walked over to him and said, "I'm so sorry. Your mother's loss hit me very hard. I have to say I wasn't sure you'd come." As the words were escaping my mouth, my head was screaming, "What are you doing? Shut up." But his face lit up and he said, "Please, can you sit down for a minute? I have a lot of questions." I quickly qualified that we weren't terribly close, but he said that didn't matter. He was just glad his mother had some people in her life because she had always had a hard time making friends, and he couldn't understand why she'd want to move out here, apparently a couple states away from where she lived her adult life. He then launched into his whole life story. He said, "I don't know how much my mother has told you." And I said, "Not too much. She was pretty introspective, you know?" Trying to say things that felt personal, but were vague enough to be universally applicable. He explained that he was adopted by his mother, and he isn't surprised I didn't realize because she always treated him the same as her biological son. And her biological son was killed in war. It took a hard toll on her and her husband, and then her husband died of a heart attack just a couple of years later. There was a whole lot intertwined in the family dynamic of the mother blaming the father for the son's death because he encouraged him to enlist, and the mother and this son I was talking to having a massive falling out when he also decided to enlist in honor of his brother. There was some other dark family times mixed in there. He said he felt horrible for not trying harder to mend fences. I just wanted to give this guy the closure that would never really exist. And I said, "You shouldn't feel bad at all. She loved you. She missed you. And she felt that after everything the two of you had been through together, she wanted to give you space to live your own life. She never went into much detail about what happened after your father passed, but hearing the full explanation makes it all make sense." He was so emotional, and he was like, "Really? She missed me? She talked about me?" And I said, "Of course she did. She was so proud of you. She'd tell everyone who would listen that you were out protecting the country, and you were an officer. But it was hard on her too. Every time there was news of an army death, she'd stop whatever she was doing and just be glued to the TV set, praying that it wasn't you or someone you knew." The guy was plain out sobbing at this point, and he asked general questions about what she was like the last few years, what she did during the day. I tried to stick to the vaguely applicable but memorable theme and said she played board games. She watched the news. He asked if she was still conservative, and I said she was still deciding what to think since the Republican Party had changed so much since her youth. I made up favorite foods, favorite songs, said she loved Ariana Grande music until she saw how promiscuously she dressed. She loved the therapy dogs that would visit the home, etc., etc. At the end of all of this, he thanked me profusely, and we talked about what to do with the body. Everything he said was logistically easy for him. I was thinking of cremation so I could keep an urn and talk to her without having to drive to a cemetery. But maybe that's superstitious. Or, I wonder if she wants to stay here, or if she'd be okay being taken back. I just said, I think that's definitely what she would have wanted, to all of it. He asked if she had a favorite flower, and because the funeral happened to have purple roses and baby's breath, the church usually just buys whatever's on sale at the florist. I told him she loved baby's breath, and he said he'd always keep a vase of them by the urn and thanked me. I said, you should know, she didn't blame you, so don't blame yourself. I figured if there was more that he wasn't saying, that he could look back and assume I meant it about whatever thing was bothering him. So that's when he leaves to go make arrangements for the body, and the pastor says, what were you thinking? What happens if he meets someone who actually knew his mother, and this interaction creeps him out for the rest of his life? Or worse, what if he finds out she didn't really love or support or even talk about him, and he's crushed? So now I feel terrible, like I just sent a ticking time bomb off into the world, and I'm racked with guilt and just had to confess this somewhere. Looking back on it all now, I can admit that it was reckless to say what I did, but in that moment, it felt impossible to just walk away. This man was so raw and desperate for something to hold on to that I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him with silence. Maybe I crossed a line and made a mistake, but if I were faced with the same situation again, I honestly don't think that I would do it any differently.